Some of you may have seen this. I think I shared this with you way back. It's through the ARRL. They do an excellent job in regards to helping new amateurs and even with senior amateurs. It's always good to do a review of some of this since we're on doing our weekly nets, our roundtable discussions, our rag chewing, simplex operations. I know that caused a little bit with the asterisk node and some of that. So we'll try and cover all this, and please stop me at any time as we're going through. We'll be glad to add to it. So the first question most amateurs ask when they start into the hobby, what is a repeater? Everybody talks about repeaters, the club repeater. I hit the repeater, 100 miles away. What is a repeater? Well, a repeater repeats what you say. Okay, with it, it's a device which will receive a signal. All right, so you transmit on one frequency, receive on another on your home radio, and the repeater listens and transmits on the opposite frequencies of what you've got set in your radio. So for instance, let's use RMI since everybody is more familiar with that. RMI up on the hill listens on a frequency of 147.870, but it transmits on 147.270. So when we hook up our radios in our handhelds or in our mobiles or our homes, we set it up to receive on 147.270. And when you key up, your frequency changes on your radio to 147.870. The repeater itself up on the hill captures your signal because it's listening on 147.87, and at the same simultaneous time transmits it on 147.270 so everybody else can hear that frequency. Okay, at a larger wattage and a larger height. So if I'm sitting here in my residence in Little Current with my handheld, I transmit, of course, the tower, 500-foot tower up on the bluff there. That's 1,100 feet above the water level of Georgian Bay, and then another 250 feet up the tower. It receives my very weak signal from my rubber ducky antenna, okay, to that repeater and retransmits it at 100 watts on a 9 dB gain antenna at 1,300 feet above the water level, right? Because if I were to sit here, there's no way I could talk to, say, Bill or Dennis or Janice or anybody in Elliott Lake or Sudbury on my handheld, right? Direct, simplex. I'll be lucky to talk to Jeff and Lou across town, I mean, your average range on a handheld with 5 watts maybe 8 to 10 kilometers, right? Anything beyond that, forget it. You're not going to do it. But with a repeater, I've now extended my handheld coverage to 100 kilometers, okay, through the repeater. And that's the benefit of working a repeater. That's why people in Sudbury and Elliott Lake can access RMI, because it's up there. All repeaters are not voice repeaters, okay? So different repeaters up there. There's digi repeaters, and as a matter of fact, Lou and I were talking about this yesterday briefly in relation to setting up something for WinLink. We have a APRS repeater that repeats your signal and sends it out over the internet and digital. So different types. There's FM voice, which are the most common. I think everybody's pretty well aware of that. There's ATV, which is amateur television, which reproduces, and it's a series of tones and signals that you will see a picture if it's transmitted to somebody else. AM and SSB They're not very common, but there are repeaters out there that will actually repeat AM or sideband signals, but they're few and far between. And then, like we talked about, digipeters used for packet radio communications, things like there used to be the packet, and then of course APRS and weather information and that type of communications. And then multi-channel wideband, okay, amateur satellites. Basically, those devices that are attached to the CubeSats and the satellites that are going around are basically huge repeaters in the sky and can repeat your signal that way with it. But the majority of us are familiar with FM voice repeaters. We've just now gone into the digital mode of repeaters, right? We're all just starting to learn about D-Star and System Fusion and DMR and how a digital repeater is somewhat similar to an FM, but the audio is a little different. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. The most popular, of course, are FM, and they've been around since the existence or the start of repeaters, and I don't see them going away anytime soon. We have repeaters on 10 meters on the 29 megahertz band, on 6 meters on the 50 megahertz band, 2 meters on 144, 220 on the 220 band, and on 440 UHF on the 70 centimeter band. So we have a lot of information where you'll find repeaters. Here in the north, the two most common are 2 meters and UHF 440. Very rare to find a 220 repeater or a 6 meter repeater or a 10 meter repeater. Even though some clubs do host them, you'll find them more so down in the big urban centers and that. And all you have to do is look at one of the repeater directories, the ARRL, and every band is listed in there where these repeaters are located and that. If the bands for 10 meters and 6 meters are wide open, oh my God, those repeaters are amazing. It's like having a huge inversion. And with just, you know, a few watts, you can work into one of those repeaters and work full quieting around the world. It's just.
I remember being in Guantanamo Bay in the 90s, late 90s, and 10 meters was open. And in the FM portion of 10 meters, I could key up on a repeater input. I'd hear like 6 or 7 different courtesy tones. I was bringing up 6 or 7 repeaters at the same time.
Yeah, I know, it's crazy. And there's only like 5 or 6 pairs of 10 meter repeaters. They're 29 600, 29 620, 29 640, 29 660. They're 20 kilohertz apart, 680 and maybe 29 700. And there's 100 hertz down. So if I was listening on a 29.600 meg repeater on 10 meters, the transmit would be 29 500 and the same going down the band there. So lots of information. So when we as amateurs use the term repeater, we are almost always talking about transmitters and receivers on VHF or higher bands where radio wave propagation is normally line of sight, right? It's not like HF where our VHF or UHF signals are bouncing off the ionosphere like Igor taught us in the propagation presentation. We're doing line of sight communications. And that's where, when we talk about simplex, what is our line of sight extents on simplex frequency? So we're, you know, you're sitting in Elliott Lake on 146.52. I'm in Little Current on 146.52. And Sudbury guys are sitting on 146.52. Depending on your distance, Elliott Lake to Sudbury may not hear each other on 146.52, but because I'm kind of in the middle and there's a clear signal both to Sudbury and to Elliott Lake, I'm in a position where in Little Current, I'm hearing Elliott Lake. Elliott Lake's hearing me. I'm hearing Sudbury and Sudbury's hearing me, right? So now I would be a relay station if required during emergency exercises because the other two distant stations can't hear one another in relation to that. So why do we use repeaters? Well, repeater expanded coverage greatly enhances the abilities to communicate with mobile stations and hams using handheld transceivers. So here again is the difference between using a repeater and using a simplex half repeater. You know, for the ProComNet on Thursday and Sunday nights. The V3RQQ asterisk node is just a simplex repeater. All right, and we call it a repeater, but it's not actually a repeater. It's a node because it doesn't repeat local signals. And that's why there was some confusion because you're used to hearing people coming through it. So what was happening when we first started, and I asked a lot of you, go over and check in, you were hearing the people coming in from all over the province, no problem, because that signal was coming in over the internet and being transmitted up on the top of the hill on that radio where the antenna is on top of the tower. So it was no problem at all. If somebody was in Sudbury going through another node, you were hearing them. But if you were local to the RQQ, the 146.55 range, what was happening is if there was a signal strong enough and you could hear them simplex, you would hear me. So Ted, if I checked in, Ted in Whitefish Falls was able to hear me. Bob and Doug up in Elliott Lake were able to hear me. And maybe I was breaking the squelch to Dennis and Tom or whoever in Sudbury, okay? But you guys couldn't hear one another unless you were local. Chances are Janice could hear Bob check in or Doug check in, okay, because they're right in the same town. They're within simplex range of one another, but they couldn't hear me or couldn't hear other stations. So it is a bit confusing with it. So we use repeaters so that when we run a net, like the Sunday morning or Thursday night, people with weaker signals on handhelds or mobiles, when Tom goes driving around Sudbury in his mobile, he's able to access RMI, or there's no way in heck, if we didn't have RMI, he'd be able to talk to us on the round table or any of the others. So that's why repeaters, it basically keeps a club together that way with it. And when you look at it, and we explained earlier, you transmit and receive on two frequencies. So this is why when you buy your radios, they have a positive and a minus shift on it, okay? What it does is it shifts. And depending on the frequency you're particularly on, the standard shift in 2 meters is 600 hertz. So for instance, TOP 147.000, it's got a plus shift of 600. So the transmit on that would be 146 or 147.600. Similarly, in Sudbury on V3 SRG, they have 147.060. However, they put a negative shift. So you would transmit on 146.460.
Which is also a simplex frequency.
It is, yeah. So normally the band plans, if you have a repeater in 146 megahertz range or 145, it goes negative. If you're in the 147, it goes positive. However, they've made a few exceptions for a couple of repeaters around the 147 range where they could go negative if required. And Sudbury opted to do that because there was a big repeater in Sudbury with a positive shift. And Sault Ste. Marie has one on 147.060 with a positive shift, and Owen Sound has a frequency down there on the same frequency. So you can get interference from them. In UHF 440, there's a 5 meg split. That's why the separation is a lot better and less interference on using a UHF repeater. But the problem with UHF is you only get about 70% coverage of what you would on 2 meters. If you had a 440 and a 2 meter repeater on the same tower running the same wattage, and that, what you would find is the 440 machine would only be about 70% of what your 2 meter repeater is. And that, so it's, that's, yep, go ahead.
Just wondering, Al, some repeaters have access tones as well, codes?
Yes,
Yeah.
PL tones.
Not the PL, an
Oh.
access tone.
Like
Where you
a
actually have to-
CTCSS.
No, that's not what I'm talking about.
Okay,
Access
sorry.
tone where you have to send a tone to even get the repeater to notice your transmission.
Yeah,
Or
when
a
I was in
DTMF
Hawaii, that
sequence.
was the case.
A DTMF sequence sometimes, closed repeaters back in the day. You hardly ever see.
Oh,
a
okay,
closed
that's what
repeater.
you're talking about.
Yeah.
Okay, yes, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, you don't find those very much anymore. I mean, I haven't dealt with one of those. I mean, they used to play with that because they had closed repeaters. They didn't want local people using. I mean, that's
Mhm.
not very good.
You had to be
So-
a member or something.
Yeah, so when you keyed up your radio, it would go doo 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 doo, and then it would open up the thing and you could transmit. Yeah, no. There may
When I was
still be a
in-
few of
When
those.
I was in
around.
Hawaii there, Al.
They had
that's
one
what
that way?
happened.
Yeah.
Al?
Well, maybe big tourist area. Maybe that's the locals didn't want all these people coming in from all over the world using their repeater. Could be the issue for that. So what happens is you set up a frequency and the repeater at the top of the hill puts the opposite. All right. And this is always important to know that, because if you don't put the right frequency pair of the opposite, what's in the directories and that, it could create quite a confusion with it. So normally your repeater trustees or people that look over repeaters for your clubs. Again, repeater, location, location, location. Some of you run repeaters. I know Frank runs a repeater from his house. We have a repeater in Espanola. A lot of people don't even know it's there, even though it's in all the books and it's that, but it's only on a 50-foot tower with a X50 antenna. So if you can pick it up at McCarrow and you lose it before you get to Webwood, and you lose it as soon as you get to Lang Lake, south of Espanola, it doesn't have a very big footprint, right? It's because location, location, location. If we didn't have RMI on a 500-foot CBC tower on the highest location on Manitoulin, you wouldn't hear it. I mean, how many of you work LTR repeater in Kagawan? When was the last time you were on LTR in Kagawan? 146.670 with a negative split. It's good repeater. It's on the top of the water tower in Kagawan, but nobody goes on it because, and the same with RII in Manitowoc. You see, we can put repeaters up and they provide local coverage for the community. But if you don't have a long range or extended coverage of those particular repeaters, they may get used by a couple of local amateurs in that area, or an offset repeater if the other one's busy, but they sit quiet 90% or 95% of the time, which isn't wrong. It doesn't cost us anything to have LTR. The location's free, the hydro's free. The township bought it as an emergency repeater. So, it's standing by. We can use it to rag chew or run a net on or do anything we want as amateurs, but it's sitting there in case the western part of Manitoulin runs into an emergency situation that RMI may not be appropriate. We can always switch over there. Same with RII in Manitowoc, right? But one of the problems that you have is if you start popping repeaters like we've done, we got one in Espanola, one in Manitowoc, one in Kagawan, and our main one on RMI, everybody flocks to the biggest repeater that they can get to, which is common sense and we know where to get a hold of one another, right? If we have 50 repeaters around that cover different areas, and they're not linked, then there's a bit of an issue with it. But anyway, again, location.
I have Al.
Yeah.
Al, you're
Mhm.
saying that we have all these repeaters and they're not linked.
Correct.
What would it take to link them? Is it worth a while, or is it?
An
Well,
internet connection is the big thing.
So before what they used to do before we had the internet, we had what we called terrestrial links, which means we'd have a repeater, we'd have a controller, and we'd put a radio on UHF, okay? 2-meter repeater, we'd have a linking radio on a simplex frequency on UHF. The next repeater in the next township or the next city would have their repeater with a linking radio on the same frequency as our linking radio on Manitoulin. With a set of tones like Bob was referring to earlier, that would set a macro which would turn on the link radios to talk to one another. Then up on the tower, not only did you have the repeater antennas, but you had 2 Yagi antennas that were pointed at one another. And what would happen is you would open up the 2 repeaters to link on another frequency. And that means anything said on this repeater on Manitoulin was heard on the Sudbury repeater and vice versa, Sudbury to Manitoulin. And that was very popular, and that was used in the 70s and 80s and 90s quite a bit before the internet came along, because it was good, but you were susceptible to propagation conditions. The links would fade. There would be, every time you repeat your audio through another radio, your audio diminishes. Okay, so it wasn't a real good audio link. Yeah, you could hear one another, and it was good to get primary information back and forth. But as you added more and more repeaters, and the same thing happens prior to the ProComNet, that's what would happen. A lot of linking systems would have those systems. And I remember under the Toronto TFM group, we at one time, and Bill, you may remember this years and years ago, where you could open up Sudbury that would link to North Bay, that would link to Powassan, that would link to Huntsville, that would link to Barrie, that would link to Newmarket, and then from Newmarket to Toronto. So you had a hop and a skip and a jump from all these different areas, and every time it went through an additional link, the audio got worse and worse and worse. Do you remember those, Bill, when we had that link going at one time?
Yes, I certainly do. And if somebody had a repeater in there with a very long tail, that caused a lot of confusion.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that with it, so, and that, so.
Well, now
Oh.
basically we're using from repeaters. We're using reflectors to do the link.
Well, we're using actually the internet, which is great. What they call VoIP, voice over IP.
Yeah.
Okay.
But like for us to connect to other repeaters.
Yes.
Okay. you still need that, geez, that reflector, right?
Well, you need, yeah, you
Even,
need
even
it.
though, even if you have the internet connection though, you still need that reflector, let's say if you want to
Not,
go out.
not with All-Star, you don't, I don't think.
No,
Well,
All-Star, you don't need a reflector.
No. Oh, is John on here? Oh, there he is. Hi, John. Good morning.
Show enough.
Yeah, go ahead. Well, explain it for a sec. I just hear Judy calling me for a sec. Just hang on. I'll be right back.
You'd think he would have her trained by now.
I'm
Okay, some
on
more
the
dirty
computer.
jokes.
I'm on the computer. Anyway, no, with All-Star, you don't necessarily need a reflector to link them together. You can designate one of the nodes, as we were talking about last week.
Okay, yeah. Mhm.
But it doesn't necessarily have to be at a place, you know, if you're only linking like 2 or 3 machines together, you know, hey, Rusty's house could be the source of the node, as long as you have the internet connection. So, but, you know, in that case, if you're going to get a whole whack of machines that you want to link together, then yeah, you want to have a hub node that has a place that has some higher bandwidth. It generally works better that way. And that's the nice thing about All-Star is you don't necessarily have to have a reflector, like in the case of IRLP. So you don't have to rely on a third party to accomplish what you want.
So C4FM would work basically the same way as OnStar?
No.
I can't speak to that.
Okay.
I suppose, what do they call them? Rooms, Rusty? Is that the same as a reflector?
Yes.
Okay.
So it's called a room.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm familiar with the other digital flavors
Okay.
where they use reflectors, or I guess it's the same thing. They just call it something different.
Okay.
Yeah, really it is.
It's exactly the same, only completely different.
Exactly the same. I like that completely different part there.
Yeah, exactly.
I was
So
just-
not impossible. There's still possibilities of doing things. It's just which one is more easy done. If you got bandwidth everywhere, then yeah, just it's easy enough to hook up to the internet and away you go. But you know, easier said than done in some situations. Anyway, over back to Al there. Looks like he's back.
I was just thinking that the DEW line was actually a series of repeater locations 100 miles apart. And the only reason they were able to offer such quality of communication was because they were using quadruple diversity, horizontal, vertical polarization, space diversity. In other words, they spaced antennas apart certain distance. They had frequency diversity as well. And, you know, so you would be communicating on different frequencies. When one dropped out, one diversity dropped out, the other diversity would take over. So you always had at least 95% reliability of communication.
That was the troposcatic system, right?
That was the troposcatic, yep, or scatter, yep.
Yeah. That's fantastic technology.
Yeah.
I'd love to do that someday. Get a link from down here up to Al's place. Can you imagine those 60-foot panels?
Oh yeah.
Al,
Right
your
after
mic's
I
not
win the
on.
lottery.
There you go. After we all win the lottery.
If
Hey,
Al, your mic's not on.
Is he back yet?
Yes, he was. but-
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry,
You have your own
I had
headset.
it
Okay.
muted there. Yeah, I mean that's exactly you know, that type of technology is wonderful. I remember back in the 80s, 70s, or no, when was it 90s, early 90s, there was a ham in Sudbury. I forgot his name, but he worked for I forget what it was, a microwave company, and he transferred to Pembroke, and he set up the microwave link on a repeater from Sudbury to Pembroke on microwave linking, and it was beautiful. It worked really good, but the amateur community didn't have a microwave system that way. That's how the OPP linked all the towers and still using it today on the government system, that they use that type of stuff that way. So, you know, I mean, it's quite interesting to do that.
Didn't
But
Dwayne
anyway,
do that too on BLZ?
who was that? Wayne? Or Dwayne?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Uh,
that's what he's doing for his All-Star node connectivity. His actual hub node is in Ballantree, and I think he's using part of that microwave system to link all the way up to BLZ.
mhm.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah. And that was, I think it was, his name might have been Jeff. He worked for the Palmarx TV station.
I think so. Something to that nature. Yeah.
Well, it's nice
Okay.
to have microwave in your back pocket.
Oh,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
You can do that.
Us PO people have to settle for the internet.
There you go. But so here, you know, here's a little basic diagram. If you're living in area A and you want to talk to people in area B, direct is not possible because you've got the mountain range. But if you were to put a repeater up in C, well, then that's basically how a repeater works, right? And that. So if we could ever get, and we had Dwayne talking about Dwayne, I don't know if you remember the days, Bill. I'm looking around to see if anybody else was around at that time. If you remembered the repeater that he put on top of the Willisville Hill Tower,
Yeah. Yeah.
you could work a handheld anywhere in Sudbury and a handheld anywhere on Manitoulin and work through that repeater. It was amazing.
It
But-
certainly was. Yeah. I had an antenna leaning on the roof, more than 45-degree angle, and a little Alinco 2-watt. And I
Oh,
could get into that repeater. You're from Sudbury.
I know. It was
Is
just
that a
like-
ham version of a lean-to?
What happened to
Yeah.
that?
Yeah.
what happened, Dwayne worked for a company called Unitel. And they had all these towers all over Ontario, and they did a lot of microwave linking for data for banks and those type of agencies and that. So Dwayne got permission to put the antenna or put the repeater. He had repeaters and put one on, and he multi-coupled it on the top of the 210C4 on the top of that Willisville Tower. It's the one where you go over the Willisville Hill. It's on the left-hand side there if you're heading towards Espanola. And it was on the top of that tower, and oh my God, that's actually what sparked RMI to get a better antenna and that because Dwayne said, this is what a real repeater should sound like. And we had RMI running off a Cushcraft 4-dipole cheap antenna with was almost like RG213 at 150 feet. It was just, or well, it was the Heliax, but it wasn't that good in that. But anyway, we changed it and things improved for sure with it. So a little bit of etiquette. Using a repeater is not much different than making any other two-way contact for sure. You have to know the difference between simplex and duplex. When two stations contact each other using the same frequency for both transmit and receive, they are said to be operating simplex. So that's the basics with that. When duplex operation is where one station transmits on frequency A and receives on frequency B, and the other station transmits on frequency B and receives on frequency A. Okay. Now, when the dual band radios first came out, there was a lot of experimentation with full duplex communications on two-way radio. And you talk about screwing up the mind with trying to talk full duplex versus half duplex, which we're all trained and kind of programmed to do. One person transmits, you listen. As soon as that person stops transmitting, you key up, you transmit, and that person listens. And that's half duplex. But when you work full duplex, that's like on a telephone conversation. Now our minds work differently in full duplex on a telephone. you're both talking at the same time and can interrupt each other on the same time. Okay. And we got used to it. All right. It's like here on Zoom, we're all full duplex. Somebody can talk over me or interrupt me or whatever the case is, right? But when you're working two-way radio, the person that's transmitting has the control of it. But what we used to do with full duplex when dual band radios came out, let's say Claude and I wanted to talk full duplex to one another. I would transmit on 146.52 on the 2 meter side. On the 440 side, what would happen is Claude would receive on 146.52, and then Claude would transmit on 446.000, and I would receive on 446.000. So what we would do is would both key up at the same time, right? Hey, Claude, how you doing? And he's going, hey, Alan. And what would happen is we're transmitting at the same time, but we're listening on opposite frequencies. And you talk about confusion, right? Because our minds weren't set to do that. As soon as Claude would say something, I'd stop talking immediately, and vice versa. And you try and work full duplex, try it sometime with another ham. If you have a dual band radio and set that up, it's quite a weird experience, believe me, especially with two-way radio. But that's the difference between simplex and duplex. And as John explained last week when he was telling you a little bit about how the Asterix and the Procom networks, that's the difference between simplex and duplex operation with our repeater.